Okay, let's get started. I know I'm a minute late. Today's daf in Masechet Chullin is 114. We're getting really far. Kufi and Daled. And so yesterday we got up to, I'm going to start from 5 lines from the bottom of Kufi Gimel Mabet. And the discussion, very interesting and very practical discussion, of course, is what is usher from basar b'chalav, where Torah says, lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, don't cook a goat, a kid, in the milk of its mother. And yesterday we learned that this prohibition probably does not apply to non-kosher animals. It does not apply to birds, which don't have milk. And it does not apply to chayot, right, to wild animals, even if they're kosher, presumably. But that's obviously a lot of discussion. And the Gemara's question today is 5 lines from the bottom of Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Bet, Itmar, Hamivashal Chelev B'chalav. Let's say you take the fat of the animal, kosher animal. Fat is not kosher to eat, of a cow, for example. So you take meat, or not meat, you take fats, which I guess is a type of meat that you're not really allowed to eat, and you put that into milk and you cook it up. And then, now we said cooking it, but the assumption here, sorry, is that you then eat that. And Rashi explains that obviously eating chelev is over an Isser Doraita. But let's say they warned you with hatra'ah and said, don't eat it because it's basar b'chalav. And you said, I don't care and I'm eating it. Do you get makot for basar b'chalav or not? So Reb Ami and Reb Asi, two Amoraim, argued, Chad Amar Lokeh, Chad Amar Eino Lokeh. One said you would get makot, and one said you would not get makot. Says what are they arguing about? Pretty obvious from what we said yesterday. Lema b'haka mifligi. Manda amar lokeh. If you say you get makot for eating basar b'chalav, that's also chelev, kasavar iser chalal iser. You hold that one iser can affect another iser. So this fat was aser because of chelev. You then cooked it with milk. It got a new iser, a second iser of basar b'chalav. Umanda amar eino lokeh. If you say you don't get makot, kasavar ein iser chalal iser, that you can't get a second isser of basar b'chalav. There is one isser, of course, of chelev, but there's no separate isser of basar b'chalav. Okay?
Question. Would
Yep.
Kimli de Rabbaneh apply here because Caleb is an Issachar and
Yeah.
Basar
So
Kalav is an ordinary prohibition?
it's a great question. So, Kimle B'drabamine essentially applies only when you have different prohibitions, right? Meaning, remember, we had many cases before where in Makot, for example, where you could get Makot many times, right? So you wouldn't say Kimle B'drabamine if the punishment that you're getting is an equal punishment. We generally use Kimle B'drabamine to either, obviously, if you're killing someone, you only can kill them once. That's the reality. Or if they're chayiv monetary things, remember, right? So that you never kill them and make them, or chayiv karet and have to pay. But here, in theory, you could get hatra twice and get makot twice. We're not really talking about what happens for the chalev. We're just talking about what happens for the basar b'chalav. So that's the first answer, is that it depends on whether you hold isser halal isser, right? The chalev was the first isser. Does the basar b'chalav affect that? That's one answer. Says the Gemara, well, not necessarily. Where am I? 3 lines from the bottom of Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Bet. Look, that in fact is not necessarily the argument. The Kuli Alma Ein Isur Chalal Isur. In fact, all these Amoraim, Rabami Rabasi, hold an Isser is not Chal on another Isser. So in theory, there should be no Isser of Basar B'chalav because it's already Asr from a Chalev. But Achila, the Kuli Alma Lapli Dilalaki. For eating this fat, for sure you're not makot on basar b'chalav because of eating the fat's already asr because it's chalev. But the question here is actually about cooking it. Ki pligi abishal, right? Now, is there any isser of cooking chalev? No, right? There's no prohibition of cooking pork. Not chalev is not pork, by the way, but there's no prohibition in cooking non-kosher meat or not edible from a halachic reason meat. The only prohibition is cooking basar b'chalav. And so let's say you cook this chalev in milk. So on the surface, of course you should be chayav because there's no other isser. But says the Gemara, fascinating answer. If you said you get makot, of course, there's no isser of cooking chalev. So there's only one isser, chad isurahu, of cooking basar b'chalav. But mandamar eno loka, the mandamar says you don't get makot, holds something very interesting. that lahachi afka rachmana la'achila b'lashon bishul, the reason that the Torah uses a funny language, right? The Torah never says don't eat basar b'chalav. It only says don't cook it. And we, of course, derive that you can't eat it, and we'll discuss it more today. But but the fact that it chooses to say it all in one language, a bishul, is telling you that these things are connected. And kivan, top of daf kuf yudalid amid aleph, kivan da'alachila lo lucky, since you cannot get makot for eating it because ain isser chalal isser, abishul nami lo lucky. You would not get makot for cooking it either. Presumably it might be asr midrabanan or asr, but you don't get makot for cooking it because it's something that if you ate with milk would not be over because ain isser chalal isser. So that's a huge, huge chiddush. That's one answer. Ikad Amri, second line of Kuf Yudam and Aleph. Some say actually it's the opposite. Abishol kuliyamalo pligi delaki. You know what? For cooking it, everybody agrees. There's no prohibition of cooking chalev. So if you make basar b'chalav and you cook it together, you of course get makot. Ki pligi a'achila. They argue about when you eat it. Manda amar eno loka is the reason we said before. Ha ein isur chalal isur. It's already asur for chalev. You can't have a second isur of basar b'chalav affected because you already have an isur of chalev, right? However, manda amar loka, if you say you do get makot, it's because, in fact, here the Torah is telling you lahachi afka rachmana la'achila b'lashon bishul. The reason that the Torah said don't eat it only b'lashon bishul is to tell you that kivan da bishul lucky achila nami lucky. That in fact isser is chalal isser, even though usually it's not. Here's an exception because since the isser, it's very interesting, right? By basar b'chalav, there's only ever an isser of achila from a pre-existing isser. There's never an isser of bishul. And so because by basar b'chalav there's an isser of not cooking it as well, the fact that there's a pre-existing isser of achila will not limit you from having a new isser of achila on the basar b'chalav, even if the food was already prohibited. So that's another explanation. And then the third explanation, or I guess the third, yeah, is the Baidema, it's actually not a machloket at all. When Rabami and Rabasi, one said you get makot, and one said you don't get makot, mar amar chada, mar amar chada, v'lo pliki. They're talking about very different cases. One is talking about eating it, where you don't get makot because ein isser chalal isser, and one is talking about cooking it, where you get makot because there's no prior isser on cooking chalev. And so, in fact, Rabami and Rabasi were not having a dialogue with each other. They were saying the halacha about very different applications of this case. So that is the machloket Rabami Rabasi. Says the Gemara, well, what about the following Braita? You just wanted to prove the ein isur chalal isur, a meitve. We've got a Braita which seems to disagree with this, because the Braita says 8 lines from the top, hamivashel b'mei chalav patur. If you cook meat with water from milk. What is water from milk? When milk, sits to make cheese, it sort of dilutes, right? Or not, it separates. And there's like water-ish, whitish kind of stuff.
Whey, called
Clear.
whey.
Whey. Is that the word?
Yeah, like the
Okay.
the nursery rhyme.
Like the nursery rhyme. Got it. So eating her curds and whey.
Exactly.
Exactly. So
Cottage
the
cheese
whey it's pretty milky. Says the Braita, it's not Isser Basar B'chalav. That's not milk. That's water from milk. It's not an Isser, but now Tosfos points out, Patur means you're not chayav, but of course you're not allowed to do it. But it's Patur. Dam shebishlo b'chalav, Patur. Same thing is true about blood. Blood is not meat, right? Blood, the Isser is Basar B'chalav. If you take blood from an animal and you cook it with milk, of course you can't eat it because you're not allowed to eat blood. But there's no isser of cooking that together because it's not meat. And furthermore, at samot, if you take the bones of the animal and the gidim, the sinews of the animal, kranayim, the horns, slafayim, the hooves, all of these things should bishlan b'chalav, putter. You're putter for all of these because it's not meat. And the isser is meat and milk. And so these are not considered meat. Now we get to the question. Continues the Braita, if it's pigol notar v'tamei, you take foods that are prohibited because it's a carbon and it was pigol, so you have to throw it away, or notar, which is carbon that's left over, or a carbon that's tamei. All of these things, shebishlan b'chalav, you cook them in milk, chayav. How can you be chayav? It's isser chalal isser. right? Because obviously they first were pigel. You took a piece of meat that was pigel and you cooked it with milk. But we just had a whole discussion in Rabami Ravasi who said Ein Isser Chal Isser and you should be putter because one Isser can't fall on the other. Answer is like, well, you're right. But there's a big machloket Tanaim about this issue. Hi Tana Savar Isser Chal Al Isser. This Tana argues and this Tana holds that an Isser is Chal on another Isser. As Rashi points out, there's many, many opinions among the Tanaim. And you can have multiple different Tanaim who have different opinions. And so therefore, it doesn't necessarily contradict what we just said. I mean, it does contradict, but it's not a problem. Okay, where am I? Continues the Gemara, Misayele the Reish Lakish. In fact, this Braita supports Reish Lakish. It's not. The following Mishnah is a very interesting Mishnah. So remember, this halacha, this is a Mishnah from Masechet Machshirin, which is not one of the commonly learned ones. But if you recall, there's a halacha about tuma that in order for food to become tamei, it has to first touch water or liquid, right? And so remember the zera, it says zera, right? Kol zera zerua, right? You have seeds. If water falls on them, then they are ready, called muchshar, to be mekabel tuma. And if they then touch someone tamei, they become tamei. But if someone tamei touches seeds that are not yet touched by water, they don't become tamei. So there's a big discussion about what liquids will be machshir a food in order to become tamei. And in the Mishnah in Machshirin, it says that, of course, water, but also what's it called? Milk, and also oil, olive oil, are enough to be machshir zra'im. Now says the Mishnah, Masechet Machshirin, Ditznan, Mei chalav harein kechalav. The water, the whey, is just like milk. And so if the whey touches the seeds, then it's like the milk, and they're muchshar lekabel tuma, and they'll become tamei. And continues the Mishnah, v'hamochel, I don't know what the English word is for mochel, but mochel is the liquid that falls out of the olives before you squeeze them. So it's not really the oil, it's sort of like again, it's just some kind of liquid that comes out of it that's not good oil. It might have a little bit of oil in it, but very little. It just flows out right away. That, harehu keshemen, you treat that like olive oil, or like oil, and it also is machshir the food. That's the Mishnah. Now, said Reish Lakish on the Mishnah, Amar Reish Lakish, 1 second. When we say that the whey, the water from the milk, is like milk, lo shanu el lahachshirat azraim. That's only for purposes of hachshara of zraim because it's considered to be a liquid. Aval le'inyan bishol basar b'chalav, in regards to whether or not it's milk, in order for the prohibition of cooking meat and milk, mei chalav einan kechalav. Then in fact, it's not milk. It's a liquid, and it's enough to be machshir the seeds, but it's not milk, and therefore there's no isser of basar b'chalav, and that, of course, is exactly what we just read in the previous Braita, which supports the opinion of the statement of Reish Lakish. Tana Rabbanan. Now continues the Braita. This is about to get a little complicated, but I'm sure we'll be able to understand it with clarity. Says the Braita, remember the Torah says, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. It says it 3 times. It only says, don't cook a kid goat, in the milk of its mother. Okay? And it says it a few times. Says the Braita, Tana Rabbanan. It says b'chalev imo. Ainli ela b'chalev imo. So I only know that you can't cook a goat in milk of its mother. How do you know b'chalev para v'rachel minayin? Now, yesterday we excluded wild animals, we excluded non-kosher animals, we excluded birds, but we didn't exclude cows and sheep, which are the other kosher animals, right? Again, we're simplifying. We're making the kosher animals cows as big animals and sheep and goats as the small ones. So how do you know that the other kosher animals that are behemot are also prohibited milk of those animals? That if you take cow's milk and you cook it with the meat, that would be a problem. Para virachel minayin. Amrit kal v'chomer. Says the Gemara, well, there's a kal v'chomer. Now, before we get to the kal v'chomer, I just want to lay out the very basic principle, which is that the Gemara makes the assumption throughout that things that are very different are prohibited. That when the Torah says don't do shatnez, don't do kilayim, right? Don't have a shor v'chamor together, like a lot of the psukim from this week's parsha. The Torah doesn't like us mixing different things, but that the more similar something is, generally the more permitted it is. Now that's the general principle. We'll see there are a lot of exceptions, but that's the general principle. So it says the Gemara, knowing that principle, let's give you a kal v'chomer. 5 lines from the last narrow line. Ma imo. Take an animal and its mother, right? A goat and its mother are the same species, and you can mate them with each other, right? We don't have any relations with animals. So ma imo, shelo nesra imo bahar ba'ah. There's no problem mating a goat and its mother, right? But nesra imo b'bishulo. But the Torah very clearly says, lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. Don't cook it. So we know that there's a prohibition on cooking it, even though there is no prohibition on mating it together. But now take a para v'rachel, take other species of animals, a sheep or a cow. Shenesra imo b'harba'ah, you can't mate a goat and a sheep. That's kalayim. So eino din shenesra imo b'bishulo, for sure you can't cook them together. So you can't have them be together. They're clearly very apart. And therefore, that's how we know that's a kal v'chomer, that you can't cook them together. Says the Braita, okay, that's a kal v'chomer. But Talmud Lomer, then we have a pasuk that says b'chalev imo. So what do you need a pasuk for? You just told me it's a kal v'chomer, so you don't need a pasuk. Halama likra. Where am I? Halama likra ha'atile. You just derived it from a kal v'chomer. And the kal v'chomer was that just that by a goat and its mother, which are allowed to be mated with each other, but they can't be cooked with each other, right? Certainly a goat and a cow, which can't mate, they certainly can't be cooked together. Says Rav Ashi, well, the reason we need a pasuk is because it's not a good kal v'chomer. Amar Rav Ashi, mishum de'ikal meimar meikar tedina pircha. The entry criteria in the kal v'chomer didn't even make sense. What was your entry criteria? That a goat and another goat are very similar because they can be mated with each other, right? You tried to learn out from its mother, that it's similar to the mother, but you know what? Actually, a goat is very different than its mother because mali imo shkin nesra imo b'shchita. Remember that an animal, this was a couple, weeks ago, otovet beno. You cannot shecht a goat and its child on the same day. You can shecht a goat and a cow on the same day. So clearly there are things about a goat and its mother, or any animal and its mother, that are more chamor than an animal and an unrelated species of animal. So you can't do a kal v'chomer and say it's always more kal it and its mother, and it's more chamor if it's another animal. Tomer b'para shel nesra imo b'shchita. There's no problem shechting a cow and a goat on the same day, even if they're friends, right? So therefore, it's not a good kal v'chomer, and that's why you need a pasuk. Talmud Lomer b'chalev imo, and therefore it says b'chalev imo. Okay, so that's the first Braita. Says the second Braita, and I'm going to simplify this because it's late on Saturday night, but I would say that this is a fascinating Gemara because the next Braita, or the third wide line, Rashi has a whole explanation, and then on Amud Bet, he says, I was all a big mistake. It doesn't make sense. And I have a better explanation. And he quotes it's a beautiful Rashi, the third line of Daf Kuf Yudal Amud Bet. Rashi says, Ro'eh ani et divrei Reb Yosef Tov Aleim, Zichrono Livracha. I like the words. I like the explanation of Reb Yosef Tov Aleim. I don't know who that was, but presumably one of Rashi's teachers. Shiri'iti Shuvat Ktav Yado. I saw, his book, its own handwriting where he explained this Gemara. So this was, obviously in those days, having access to previous publications was very rare. And Rashi loves this pshat. So I'm going to read it according to this pshat. Says Rashi, the assumption now, the third line, is that the previous Braita is correct. And that the pasuk says, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, with extra time, to tell you that not only includes goats and its mother, but includes cows and sheep. Take that for granted. But ask the Braita, what about another goat? Right? So let's read that inside. Tanya idach. B'chalev imo, ein li ela b'chalev imo. I only know a goat and its mother. Now, again, Rashi's assuming, and a goat and a cow and a goat and a sheep. But what about chalev achoto gedola minai? What about its big sister? How do you know that a sheep and a big sister are also prohibited? Now, what does big sister mean? So we're going to see in a second. Remember, there's a concept of maaser behema, right? If you have 10 animals, you have to put them into a pen together. You count them up, and you give each 10th one to the Kohen. Not to the Kohen. You take each 10th one as a carbon, right? In the Beit HaMikdash, etc. That's maaser behema. Okay. Remember that there's a rule that there's a Rosh Hashanah for maaser behema, beginning of El, beginning of Tishrei, and every animal that's born before that time is in previous year, and every animal after the time is in the next year. And what you have to do is you band together these animals, and you take maaser from one of those animals on the others. You cannot take maaser from next year's animals on past year's animal or this year on next year, and you don't add up the animals from 2 different years, right? So that says Rashi, Achoto, or Yosef Tovilem actually, that Achoto Gedola means an older sister of this goat that was born last year or 5 years ago. So that the maaser year of the other goat is different than this one. And we'll see why that matters. So in that case, how do you know that there's a prohibition of basar b'chalav? Says the Braita, what do you mean? It's a kal v'chomer. Amri kal v'chomer. Ma imo shenichnasa imo l'dir l'taser nesra imo b'bishul. Its mother, now in theory, a mother goat can be born in the same year as its baby goat, right? A goat can be born 6 months later, it gives birth to another goat. I don't know exactly how long, but let's just say a short period of time. So then those two goats are born in the same year and they can both go together to take off maaser. So they're very similar. But still the Torah says, don't cook the meat with the milk. So achoto hagdola shelo nichnasa ima l'dir l'taser. The big sister that was born last year or 5 years ago cannot go into the pen together for maaser. So they're very different. So if kal v'chomer no din shenesra ima b'bishul, for sure you can't cook them together. So it and its mother, which may even be the same year, are prohibited. For sure, it and its sister that was born in a different year are prohibited. So that's the kal v'chomer. Continues the Braita. Talmud lomer b'chalev imo.
Its sister can't be older than its mother.
Right. Doesn't mean it's not. It's a good point. It means a different case, right? You could have a case of a mother that was born in the same year. That's where the milk might be prohibited. Obviously, if the sister is 5 years older, the mother's also 5 years older, right? But it's saying that the Torah saying mother could mean only a mother that was born in the same year, right? Or let me put it this way, even a mother that was born in the same year. So even though they're very similar and they were born in the same year, you can't eat the milk and meat. So for sure, a sister that's not similar, because it was born in a different year, you can't eat the milk and the meat. So therefore, it continues the Braita, Talmud lomer, the pasuk comes to say b'chalev imo. And again, the same question. What do you mean you need a pasuk? If you just had a kal v'chomer, why do you need a pasuk? Halama likra atyalei, you just learned it from a kal v'chomer. And Rav Ashi explains, again, Rav Ashi, mishum de'ikal amemer meikar dedina pircha. You can ask again on this kal v'chomer. Because what's your question on the kal v'chomer? Mehecha kamayt t'lei imo, you said, look, a goat is very similar to its mother because if they're born in the same year, because they can get maaser together. So for sure, it and its sister, which you can't give maaser. But mali imoshke nesri mo b'shchita. But you're never allowed to shecht a goat and its mother on the same day. There's no problem shechting a goat and its sister, even if they're 10 years apart, or no matter what. Tomar ba'achoto hagdola shelo nesri mo b'shchita. So in fact, you showed one area in which a goat and its mother are similar, but there's other areas in which they're very dissimilar, like shchita, where you're not allowed to do it on one day. Talmud lomer b'chalev imo. Therefore, you have a second pasuk according to Rashi that says lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo, to tell me even another goat that's very dissimilar because it was born in a different year. Says the Gemara, okay, that's another goat, ashkechan achoto gedola. That is a goat that was older, that was born in a different year. But what about achoto ketana minayin? How about a goat that has a sister goat that was born in the same year? That's achoto ketana. So says the Gemara, well, in fact, you don't need a pasuk for that because you can learn it from a mahatzat, atyam mibineha. You can learn it from between them. Says, well, what does that mean? Hey, Teti, what do you learn it from? Teti me'imo. Say, look, oh, if mother's prohibited, for sure the sister's prohibited. But maybe not, because the mother is nesra imo b'shchita. You can't check the goat and its mother. You could check the goat and its sister. Mali moshki nesra imo b'shchita. Says, remember, it's true. But we just learned from a pasuk that you also are not allowed to shech the goat with the milk. I'm sorry, not allowed to cook a goat in the milk of its big sister, which you can shech. So achoto hagdola tochiach. But then you'll say, well, but achoto gedola is different because you can't do maaser together. But the mother, which you could in theory do maaser if it was born in the same year, is tochiach. And chazar hadin, you go back and forth. Lo rizeh rizeh. The unique aspect of one is not like the other. Lo rizeh rizeh. Atzara shava shabahan. The commonality between them is shehu basar v'asur l'vashel b'chelev. It's kosher meat. You can't cook it with milk. Same thing is true of ani avi achoto ktana shu basar v'asur l'vashel b'chalav. Okay, so we basically have a pasuk for the big sister, and because we have a pasuk for the big sister, we can learn out the little sister. Says the Gemara, 1 second. But by the same logic, you don't even need a pasuk for the big sister. Because you, and again, this is how Rashi explains it. You already had a pasuk to include a cow, right? So if you have a cow that's included and you know the mother is included, you don't need a pasuk for the big sister because you can say the big sister should be learned out from them. Now, which one? From the mother, the mother, you can't shecht it on the same day, but a cow you can shecht on the same day. A cow's very different because it's not taking maaser. But so too is the mother, so too is this animal not taking maaser. Says the Gemara, "Ein chinami." You're right. You actually could learn out the sister from the cow. So then what do you need the pasuk for? Ela b'chalev imo lamali. In fact, you need that for a different purpose. Says the bright to the last line of Kuf Yudalid, B'chalev imo. The pasuk says, Lo tevashal gedi b'chalev imo, ein li ella chalev imo. That would only tell me, turn the page, its mother's milk. What about its own milk? What if you milked the goat before it died, before you shechted it? Then you shechted it, and you want to cook the goat in its own milk. Hi atzmo b'chalba minayin. And again, this is a question because the closer something is connected, the less likely it is to be usher. So maybe you only prohibit a goat in its mother's milk because it's different. Maybe a goat in its own milk would be permitted, which would be crazy, right? Or crazy to us because we don't do this. But maybe that's the case. Says the Braita, Amri Kal V'chomer. Again, it's a Kal V'chomer. Ma b'makom shel nesar pri im pri. Now again, the Gemara now, the Braita, uses these words pri. Pri literally means offspring, right? Fruit. So if you think about it, let's say you take a goat and you have milk of the goat, right? So that is a mother, we'll say, with its pri, with its offspring, right? The mother is the goat. The pri is the milk that comes from that goat, right? If you have a goat and its mother's milk, right? So then you have what's called pri im pri, because the goat is the fruit of its mother, and the milk, the mother's milk, is the fruit of the mother, right? So that relationship is pri im pri, and the relationship of a goat to its own milk is a pri with its mother, im aim. Okay, so that's just terminology. Says the Gemara now, the Kal V'chomer, the top line of Kuf Yud Daled Amud, Ma b'makom shel nesar pri im pri b'shchita. Right? The Torah does not prohibit you to have to not shecht a pri im pri, meaning if a mother goat has two babies, you can, or whatever, a cow has two babies, those are both pri of the mother, and you could shecht them both on the same day. But you're not allowed to shecht ne'asar pri im ha'im b'shchita. You cannot shecht an offspring with its mother on the same day. That's otovet beno. So you see that a pri and pri, meaning two offspring, are easier to do together than a pri and its mother. So that's the given. So now makom shenesar pri and pri b'bishul, but basar b'chalav is always lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo, which is a pri and pri, right? It's a goat that's a child of a mother, and milk that comes from the mother. So if the pri and pri is aser, ein odin shenesar pri and ma'im b'bishul. So for sure, a goat and its own milk, which means the mother goat and the milk that came from that goat, should be aser. That's the Kal V'chomer. Talmud Omer b'chalev imo. Again, ask the Gemara, what do you mean? Why do you need a pasuk if you have a Kal V'chomer? Halama likra, actually, you learn from a Kal V'chomer. Amar Rav Devai bar Ami, because that's not a great Kal V'chomer. You're making these concepts of pri and pri, right? A descendant and or offspring and another offspring are stricter, are less strict than a pri im aim, because you can do shchita of a kid and another kid, but you can't do shchita of a kid and its mother, right? But there's a lot of exceptions to that rule. Let me give you a click of obvious exception. Mishum deikla memer suspen susyach per dayochiach. Think of this case. You've got a horse, right, whose mother is a horse, right? But that mother horse was a little promiscuous, and she also slept with a donkey. And they developed what's the child a pirda? I don't know if I have my right words, but a mule. A mule is a pirda, right? All right. So the horse slept was mated with another horse and had a baby horse, but also the mother had a donkey, right? Or a mule. I don't know the difference. A mule. Okay.
A mule.
So, thank you. So again, here you have pri and pri, meaning two children of one mother horse, but they obviously cannot mate with each other because they're different species. One is a mule and one is a horse, right? So let's read that inside. So a sus ben susya, a horse that came from a mother horse, who is a brother of a pirda, of a mule, yochiach. Because in this case, asur pri and pri, the donkey, the mule, and the horse cannot be mated with each other, but mutar pri and but the horse can be mated with its mother, who's also a horse. So you see, in this case, it's the opposite of what you assume, that even though it's prohibited if it's pri and pri, it's permitted if the pri with the mother. So but that's not a proof at all. The reason it's prohibited if it's a pri and pri is not because of the mother, it's because of the father, right? Hatam zera ha'avu the kagarim. It's because there's other genetic material, because it's a mule, right? And let me give you an example. A pered ben susya. Let's say you have a mule that came from a horse, right? Because the father was a donkey. Achi pirda. And the other sister, right, of that horse is also a mule, because they both came from a donkey. So then you have pri and pri, and they of course can be mated with each other because they're the same thing. Yochia. Shemutar pri and pri, right? The two mules can be mated with each other, but they cannot be mated with their mother because their mother is a horse. Vasur pri im ha'im. So that's not a good proof. You can't prove that I'm wrong from this case of donkeys and mules and etc.
Well, and mating two mules isn't going to result in anything.
Okay, but it's not prohibited, I guess. But
It's not, yeah.
right. So there won't be a product, but maybe they need it. El Amar Mar says Mar Brei Ravina says Mar Brei Ravina Mishum de Ika Lememar. I'll show you a different case, which is not so different, of slaves. Take a case of an Eved ben Shifcha Achi Mishuchraret. You have a shifcha, right? A slave. She is impregnated, has a child. That child is an Eved. Okay. That she also has another child who is freed, who's now a free woman, who's a Jew, right? Because that's what happens to an Eved that's freed. So in this case, one slave is not allowed to sleep with the free person, because you're not allowed to sleep with an Eved, right? So let's read that inside. So the case here is Eved ben Shifcha, a slave, the son of a non-slave, a slave, the son of a Shifcha, a slave, Achi Mishuchraret, who's a brother of a free woman. So Yochiach, because there, of course, the slave cannot sleep with the free woman because you're not allowed to. She's Jewish. Sha'asur pri and pri, but mutar pri and but would be permitted to the mother because they're both avadim, right? Says again, the same point there. The reason that you're prohibited to the relative to the pri and pri is not because of a halacha, it's because the free woman was freed. So she's no longer a pri, essentially. Hatam get shechur de kagarim. It's the fact that she was a free woman is that prohibits the pri and pri. Let me give you, because if you look at the opposite case, the Eved ben Mishuchraret, let's say the mother was freed, right? But after she had a child, so she had a son and a daughter. So the son is an Eved, and the sister is a Shifcha. They're both slaves, right? Achi Shifcha, and now the mother's free, Yochia. So now the Eved and the Shifcha can be mated with each other because they're both slaves. But neither one can sleep with, not neither one, the Eved cannot sleep with the mother because she's a free woman now, right? So again, the point is not the relationship. The point is the halachic technicality of did you free the person or not free the person. Let me read it inside. Eved ben mishucheret achi shifcha yochiach shemutar pri and pri avasor pri ha'im. Ella Amar Avidi bar Avin mishum teikal meimar kalai zara yochiach. I love this case. The issue here is, think about this week's parsha, right? Where it says you're not allowed to plant things together. You can't take a grain of wheat and a grain of barley and plant them together. Now, if you think about it, a grain is a pri. What's the mother of the grain? Mother Earth, Rashi says. Okay? So the aim of a grain is the earth, the eretz, the land, which produced grain. The grain is a pri, right? Chita is one pri, Saor is another pri. Think about it. In this case, you're not allowed to plant the pri and pri, but you're allowed to plant the pri with its mother, meaning you could put the chita in the ground, which is its mother, right? So let's read that inside. So kla'ei zra'im yochiach she'asur pri and pri. You can't put together the two products of the ground with each other. Mutar pri im ha'im. But you're allowed to put it into its mother. So you see that your whole kal v'chomer is wrong. You made an assumption that it's more prohibited to be a pre-im ha'aim, but here by Klaim, sorry, pre-im pre is aser, but pre-im aim is mutter. Says the Gemara, well, that's ridiculous because the only reason that pre and pre is aser is because you put them in the ground, right? Klum ne'asar pre and pre el ha'im. You only prohibit one seed with another because of the mother, because you put them in the ground. Because the reality is, and we're not doing Masechet Kilayim now, but Kilayim is only in the ground. Remember, if you put Kilayim in a pot, there's no problem, right? If it's not connected to the ground. The chiti sa'ari b'kada v'lo mitzri. So, says the Gemara, none of this really addresses our question. El Amar Ravashi, the real.
Oh, but before you go on, a question.
Yeah.
This sounds like the Noahide laws don't apply to slaves,
So,
because
it
those
does,
those close forbidden relationships are even prohibited in Noahides.
right. It does sound like that. It sounds like that. Let me think, let me look and just make sure I don't want to tell you the wrong thing, but it does sound like that. Again, yes, it does sound like that. Let's leave it at that. And
Okay.
then let me give me till tomorrow to make sure it's really true. But that is exactly what the Gemara sounds like.
Okay.
Um, I think it's a little, yeah. Let me look into it. I do think it's correct, but I just want to confirm that. Okay.
Okay.
Um, but um, but yes, so it says the Gemara, Ela Amar Ravashi, halfway down, Misham Dikla Meimer Mala Pri and Prishkin Shnei Gufim. The reality is that your Kal V'chomer is not a good Kal. Remember, this problem that we started with was we had a pasuk to say that a gedi that's cooked with its own milk is prohibited. And the Gemara said, well, it's a Kal V'chomer. Because since a gedi is a pre would be aser, right? Sorry, by shchita, you can shecht two offspring on the same day, but you cannot shecht this a gedi and its mother, right? Or any animal and its mother. So pre-im aim is worse than pre-im pre. But now by Bishul, it already said don't cook a mother's milk and the child, right? Basar b'chalav. So if pre-im pre is aser, for sure pre-im aim. Says Ravashi, it's not you can't say that Kal V'chomer because you could say there's a big difference. Ma the pri and prishkein shnei gufim. The reason it's prohibited to cook milk that comes from the mother with the animal that comes from the mother is because they come from two different things, meaning they don't come from two different things, but they're two different entities. One is the gedi and one is the mother's milk. But tomar b'priyim ha'im shkein guf echad. You might have said, look, a goat and its own milk all come from the same source, and therefore maybe it's permitted to cook a goat in its own milk. And therefore, Mishamachi Itzrich, and that's why you need a second pasuk to tell you that even a goat and its own milk would be prohibited. So that is where we conclude from this Braita why you need a pasuk. Now, just before we finish today, which half a daf, but it's going to go very quick, says Rav Ashi, we all of psukim only talk about cooking. Minayin lebasar b'chalav sha'asur b'achila. How do you're not allowed to eat it? Shenemar, it's based actually. I know we all think we know the pasuk is because it says 3 times, but Rav Ashi has another explanation. Shenemar, the pasuk says lo tochal kol to'eva. Don't eat anything that is off limits, that is forbidden, or to'eva, which means I don't know how we translate it, disgusting or whatever. Says the Rav Ashi, what that tells you is a general lo taseh. Kol sheta'afti lecha riu b'bal tochal. Anything that I, God, in the Torah says is off limits, don't eat it. I say don't cook milk and meat, and therefore you can't eat milk and meat. Says, well, okay, well that's eating. How do you can't get hana'ah? Well, that is Kid Rabbi Yavo. Dam Rabbi Yavo, Amar Belazar, said Rabbi Yavo in the name of Rabbi Belazar, Kol makom shenema lo yachal lo tochal lo tochlu. Wherever the Torah uses a verb to say don't eat in any way, it means don't eat and don't get hana'ah. And you know why I know that? Because there's one exception where the Torah specifically says by nevela, don't eat nevela, give it away to a ger or sell it to a non-Jew. Why does the Torah have to say give it away or sell it? Because it's telling you that usually when it says don't eat, it means don't eat and don't sell it or give it away, meaning don't get any hana'ah. Here, you're allowed to do that, but this is the exception, and this tells you the rule about everything else. Okay, so let's read it inside. The only time that don't eat means don't eat alone is when the Torah says, and you can give it away. the way the Torah says by nevela, where it says leger benetina or leovei kochavim b'mechira, that you can give it to a ger. Here, ger means not a Jew, a ger toshav, right? A ger, because obviously a Jew cannot eat nevela, right? You give it to a ger toshav, who's a non-Jew who agrees to live under the rules and follow all the restrictions and the Sheva B'nai Mitzvah B'nai Noach and the rules of the Jewish sovereign state, let's say, and you can sell it to a non-Jew who doesn't fit into those categories. The Tanya, as the Breita said, that now we're quoting the pasuk. It says, "Lo tochlu kol nevela." Don't eat an animal that's a nevela. Remember, nevela is an animal that was died without shechting. Leger asher b'sharecha titznena. You should give it to a ger in your gates, meaning a ger toshav, v'achla, and they'll eat achela, and they'll eat it. O mechor lenachri, or you sell it to a non-Jew. That's the pasuk. Says the Breita, ein li ela leger benetina lovei kochavim b'mechira. The pasuk says you can give it to a ger or sell it to a non-Jew. That's all I would know you're allowed to do. How do I know that you can do the vice versa? That if you want to sell it to a ger or give it away to a non-Jew, that's permitted. Leger b'mechira minayin. So first we'll do a ger. How do you could sell it to a ger? Talmud Omer leger titznenu o mechor. If you read the psukim and you cut them halfway, it says give it to the ger o mechor, or sell it. Now, of course, it says o mechor lenachri. But if you stop short, it tells you can do both for a ger. And then the same question is the ovei kochavim b'netina minayin. How do we know that if you want to, you can hand it over as a gift to an ovei kochavim, even though the Torah says sell it? Talmud, because if you read the pasuk this way, leger asher b'sharecha, give a pause, titznena, you give it, oh, mechar lenachri. Nimsa, it turns out, says Rabbi Meir, echad ger ve'echad ovei kochavim, whether it's a ger toshav, whether it's an ovei kochavim, you can do whatever you want. Bein b'mechira, bein b'netina, divrei Rabbi Meir. You can sell it, or you can give it away. Rabbi Yehuda says, I disagree. Dvarim kichtavam. The pasuk is literal. You have to get rid of it either by giving it to a ger toshav or selling it to a non-Jew. You cannot sell it to a ger toshav. You cannot give it away to a non-Jew. Dvarim kichtavam. Leger b'netina. You can hand it as a gift to a ger or leovei kochavim b'mechira. Says Gemara, what's the reason for Rabbi Yehuda? What about the psukim that Rabbi Meir quoted? My time at Rabbi Yehuda. Because he says, Rabbi Meir, if Rabbi Meir is correct, then Lichter Rachman of the Torah should have said, Lo tochlu kol nevela, right? Leger asher b'shrecha titznena v'achla u'mechar. It should have said, give it, sell it, o lamali. The o implies or do one. It's one or the other, not both to each individual, to a non-Jew and to a ger. It says, oh. So, lamali shmamina lidvarim kichtavam huda'ata, that basically it's an either or. Leger b'netina, you can either give it to a ger as a gift, or le'ovei kochavim b'mechira. So that's Rabbi Yehuda's drasha from the word o. Rabbi Meir, what does Rabbi Meir say to you? Amar lecha hai o lahaktim. The purpose of the word o is to separate, is to tell you, look, you can do either one, but we prefer, the Torah prefers if you give it to a ger. Lahakdim netinat de ger lemechira de'ovei kochavim. We prefer if you give it to a ger over selling it, but you're allowed to do either one. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you don't need a pasuk to tell me that. Lahakdim netinat de ger lemechira de'ovei kochavim lo tzarich kra. You don't need a pasuk to tell me that if everything else is equal, you should give it away to a ger toshav. Svaro. It's a logical conclusion because right? Part of a ger toshav means that they agree to follow the regulations, which also means that you have a responsibility, like with Yoshua and the Givonim, to protect them and to support them. So you actually have to give welfare and support and nourish a ger toshav who's not Jewish, right? And so therefore, because you have a responsibility, it makes much more sense that if you're going to choose, it's better to give it to a ger than to sell it to a ger or to give it to a non-Jew. Right? And therefore, you don't need a pasuk for that. Rabbi Meir says, I disagree. The Torah tells the word o to tell you that we prefer that you give it away to a ger over sell it to a non-Jew, but either one is permitted according to Rabbi Meir, and this is the source, Motzaei only according to Rabbi Meir, that in fact, when the Torah says don't eat something, it usually means don't eat it and don't get hana'ah, except where the Torah says, like by nevela, if you want, you can sell it or you can give it away. And so that is the reason why we have that exception. Tosfos makes a very interesting point here. I'll just close with this. Tosfos makes a point. I mean, many wonder, like, what's the issue here? Like when we say you should preference giving it away to a ger over selling it, right? Why can't you do whatever you want with it? So Tosfos says, very interesting, not everyone agrees with this, that the whole issue here is that they lived in a place where there were very few non-Jews, which I don't know when that was true, but let's just say there was a time that was true. And therefore, if you have a nevela, there's no market for that nevela because who's buying nevela, right? Everyone keeps kosher. And so basically, this is Tosfos says, very interesting. He says, so selling it to a non-Jew means you're going to get pennies on the dollar, right? You're going to sell it for a nominal amount. So that's where the Gemara says, look, if you're going to sell it for a nominal amount, it's probably a better idea to give it away to a Dir Toshav because, first of all, you probably get more value, right? You have to feed him anyways, right? So you're getting much more value by providing food for someone you have to provide for rather than selling your $10 steak for $1 to a non-Jew. But says Tosfot, it's very fascinating Tosfot. He says it's obvious to me, Pshita, he says, that Shem Yesh Chayfetz La'adam Limkar, if a person wants to sell his meat, he can sell it. There's no precedence that you have to give it away. We're not making you give charity here, right? The point is that it's very low value and it's a smart thing. You might as well give it away. But that is Tosfos's point. Not everyone agrees with that point, but that is a very interesting point. So we'll stop there. God willing, we'll pick it up tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m. And just to go back, the continuation is that the source that we just said from Rashi, that you're not allowed to get hana'ah from basar b'chalav or eat basar b'chalav is from the pasuk lo tochal kol to'eva, right? Which implies don't eat things that are off limits. And what that means is including things that the Torah says don't do. So since the Torah says don't make basar b'chalav, you're not allowed to eat it and you're not allowed to get hana'ah from it. We're going to ask tomorrow's daf is going to be about what about all kinds of other prohibitions, right? For the first case is going to be what if you cook on Shabbos, right? So that's an Isser Doraita, obviously a huge Isser of Skila. So is it now the food's prohibited to eat? And we're going to discuss that kind of thing tomorrow. So 7:45 a.m. Hope you can all join us.
Question.
Yes.
The thing that has not been discussed is giving the nevela to your animals.
That is correct. I mean, you could obviously, but
Well, we feed non-kosher cat food to our cats.
yes, so you could. I mean, if you could give it away to a person, you can give it away to an animal. But yes,
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line is you're allowed to get hana'ah, right? There's
Yeah.
no prohibition. According to Rabbi Yehuda, there's a very specific requirement that you're supposed to give it away before you sell it in that circumstance, but not cat food, I presume.
Yeah. All right, Yasher Koach, Shavua
Sure.
Tov.
So,